Welcome to this week's Insights. On this week's Insight show, we're going to be covering three topics. One of them is going to be the continued collapse of the Turkish Lira and the impact that it's going to have regionally on economics and politics in the region, and specifically in regards to Armenia, diplomatic openings and other matters. The second issue we're going to be covering is the announcement by the Armenian Foreign Ministry and the Foreign Minister of the Erdogan regime that there's going to be special envoys assigned to help establish relations between Armenia and the Turkish Republic. And lastly, and most importantly, we'll be covering yesterday's meeting in Brussels between European President Michel, Armenian Prime Minister Pashinyan, and the dictator from Baku. Let's start off with the Turkish Lira. And why with this? Because I think the economic problems of Turkey are frankly going to color a good part of politics in this region, and specifically that country's foreign policy, which obviously has a great amount of effect on us. First and foremost, there has been a tremendous depreciation of the Turkish lira versus the dollar and other major currencies. In fact, the Turkish lira now is the worst performing currency in the world. It's actually lost 50% of its value over this year, which is 2021. And that is expected to accelerate as we move into next year. And what does this actually mean for the country, for those who are not that tuned to economics? Obviously, the cheaper your currency gets, the more expensive imports get. And obviously, the world economy today is greatly integrated with each other. And Turkey itself actually imports far more than it exports traditionally, because it has no natural resources when it comes to gas and oil. So they spend a lot of money on that. And the weaker your currency becomes, essentially the poorer your people becomes. And obviously that has distinct political implications for the regime at hand. Now, what has caused the immediate crisis is Erdogan's insistence on cutting interest rates at a time where all of the world's central banks are raising interest rates, which makes the currency even less valuable. Now, to put this in understandable terms, his idea is that you cut inflation by cutting interest rates. And this would be sort of the equivalent of the head of the physics department someplace claiming that gravity doesn't exist. It's that level of economic ignorance, and the Turks are essentially paying the price for his ignorance. Now, why this is relevant is when countries like Erdogan's regime have problems, they essentially try to export those problems. And we saw some of that last year. We got a taste of it in 2020 when his forces essentially led the ethnic cleansing of good parts of Artsakh to essentially keep people distracted from his problems by exporting and talking about foreign policy. And I think next year it could be the eastern neighbors, Greece and other countries, that will be getting that treatment if the economy keeps getting worse. And there's a lot of historical precedents for this. In 1982, when the country's currency was collapsing and the economy was collapsing, the Argentine generals decided to invade the Malvinas Island that was under British control, which ended disastrously. However, they did start a war that killed a lot of people. So countries that are cornered like this are quite dangerous. And if he continues these policies, what we are likely to have is hyperinflation and political instability. So, he keeps talking about he wants to they're fighting the war of economic independence. And just to show what a level of ignorance that is, there's actually the only countries that are independent economically in the world are countries like North Korea or Iran, that's been isolated, and Cuba. And if he continues these policies, he's essentially going to turn his country into Pakistan with really nice beaches. Now let's move on and talk about the second topic, which was the announcement that there's going to be special envoys appointed by the Armenian and the Turkish side to establish relations. Let's just step back and look at a little bit of background here. Every Armenian government, pre-revolutionary, after revolutionary, all of them since 1991, have said that they're ready for complete normalized relations with Turkey. The problem has always been the other side, because they've always come up with this excuse, that excuse, Artsakh, this, and a half a dozen different things. Now, I think if this ever comes to fruition, which again I'm doubtful about, but we'll get to that later, it's actually a good thing. We need to have relations. I've heard constant complaints from our diplomats that during times of crisis they cannot speak to the Turkish state directly, and I think that is something that will be quite helpful. Now, why am I skeptical about this? Is because for many different reasons. Let's exactly go to 2010, in which it was none other than the United States and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, with actually President Obama's involvement, that tried to establish these relations, and they brokered the deal that the Turks backed out of. So if they're not willing to go along with an understanding that was reached by the most powerful country in the world, why would they suddenly change course 10 years later when their country is, far worse politically, and it's on who the type of leadership and the type of rhetoric that they're using. So it's a bit of a fanciful notion. The primary reason that this is not likely to go anywhere is, as we stated earlier about the Lira crisis, is the political crisis in Turkey. When a country is going through an economic crisis, a political crisis, that's not the time where you make breakthroughs with adversaries or people who you've traditionally had problems with, because there's really no incentive for that. Secondly is the direct relationship that exists between the Aliyev and Erdogan regimes. Some of it actually involves personal business relationships. And these relationships will not be established unless they're established in Baku's terms, which most likely are going to be unacceptable for the Armenian side. And most importantly, there's actually no political constituency that is relevant in Turkey that is actually pushing for these relations. And this is mostly a dog and pony show to fool foreigners and Westerners specifically, who are gullible enough to believe that Erdogan's regime can at some point be reformed to some kind of a normalized state. And lastly, just the notion that you're appointing special envoys. You don't need to have special envoys. That's why you have foreign ministers. If you're serious about establishing relations, you establish relations. It is not that complicated. Let's move on to our third and final topic, which was yesterday's meetings in Brussels, the summit that was organized by the European Union between Prime Minister Pashinyan and the dictator from Baku. How should we look at this? I think as a matter of principle, any conversation, any place where there's negotiations or talking going on that is of a Western format is actually preferable for us, because for one primary reason, because it essentially any format that does not include Turkey and has more neutral Western observers is a much better format for us. And this specifically, I think this is a European response to this 3+3 negotiating format, which has become 3+2, which is the three Caucasus countries with Iran, Turkey, and Russia. Anything that gets away from this 3+2 situation is actually good for us, because one of the biggest problems with the format is essentially it legitimizes the Turkish role in the Caucasus, and our foreign policy should be focused on doing everything that delegitimizes the Turkish role in the Caucasus. Now let's go to the 3+2 format. I think we might be actually making too much of this, is because given the conditions that the Armenian side has put in joining, which is that this does not replace the OSCE format, and anything the OSCE format does, the 3+2 cannot do. I don't see much there that for these people to talk about, unless they're talking about opening trade routes, which, for the most part is not bad for us. So anything that sidelines this organization or this setup is actually good, but there's a very good chance that this 3+2 format, even if it comes together on a consistent basis, ends up being another worthless talking shop, as which we have plenty of in the diplomatic world. Now let's go over the specifics of what was discussed and announced yesterday. The most important thing, and the only thing that the two sides actually agreed upon, was the importance of opening up railway routes, which would be railway going through Sunik in Azerbaijan to Russia for our purposes, and going through Nakhchivan to Iran for our purposes, and again for Azerbaijan to be able to access Nakhchivan through Sunik via the traditional train networks that were there during Soviet times, which, by the way, are all, at least on the Armenian side, are owned by Russian companies, which I think is another one of the incentives for the Russians to keep pushing for this. is actually a good thing, because we should be for opening up the trade networks, especially on train networks, because we have a lot more to gain than the other side has, because the other side has far more access routes than we do. So anything that specifically talks about opening train routes is a net positive for the Armenian side. Let's move on to the other declarations or statements that came out of yesterday's meeting. Both Prime Minister Pashinyan and President Michel emphasized on the importance of humanitarian issues, which in this case is the return of our POWs who are illegally held in Aliyev's dungeons. So both made statements in regards to the importance of this issue being resolved unconditionally. President Michel moved on to release a statement that talked about the Europeans have set up a system to help in the demarcation process, which is, again, not a bad thing. It's more parties involved, the better. Now, if the Azeris will ever accept that, we don't know. Thirdly, what was discussed was to create direct connections between the Armenian defense minister and the Azeri defense minister so they can speak directly. Again, in a normal setting, not a bad thing. What it means in practical terms is hard to say. The President, Michel, also made it clear that the European Union is willing to help fund things like demining, the construction of other things, and damage that's been done from the war in Artsakh and in other places. So they're actually willing to engage. But the one thing that was actually quite revealing yesterday was what came out of the disagreements. And I think this might be giving us a little clue of the direction that if any of these issues are ever resolved, we can actually understand what the source of the issue is. And what it involves, either train networks or road networks, is the fact that I think Aliyev has complained, and he complained publicly about the fact that Armenia has access to Artsakh without any preconditions into territory, which is the Bertsor corridor, which he considers his, but it's not controlled by Russia. But Armenians come and go without any control as far as access goes in that connection from the Azeri authorities. While Armenia is insisting that any transportation route through Sunik that goes to Nakhchivan will be under the customs control of Armenian customs, i.e. things will be checked, what's coming and what's going. And if you can check what's coming and what's going, you can reject what's coming and what's going. So I think this is something that's caught in his throat, because in the November 9th agreement, there's absolutely nothing about the Azeri side having any say about transportation routes between essentially what are two parts of Armenia and Artsakh itself. And I think this is what he has a hard time swallowing. And I think this is the concession that he wants to get out of us, so he can tell his people, well, if the Armenians come and go as they please, we can come and go as they please without any checks. In conclusion, what should we make of all this? Very much like the Sochi meeting, perhaps even more so than the Sochi meeting, because the Russians are far more credible mediator than the EU is, because people fear the Russians, they really don't fear the EU, is that there's probably a lot less here than meets the eye. On one level, it is always better to talk than to fight. It's always better to communicate than not to communicate. However, I think what people miss here is the political incentives that both sides operate in. It is in Armenia's interest, and in fact, it's in the interests of other powers in the world, to have a normalized process in which you don't have fighting, you have access in trade routes, and you sort of freeze the current situation for an extended period of time. That is not Aliyev's interest. Aliyev is trying to maximize what he can get while he has the advantage, especially militarily. And he knows that every day that goes by, that equation could change. If it doesn't change now, it can change 5, 6, 7 years from now. So I think that is the problem. The problem is one side and not the other. And the Azeri state is Aliyev, and Aliyev is the Azeri state. He has no incentive to have a normalized situation or something that is peaceful, because at the moment he does not have the foreign boogeyman to blame for his problems, in this case Armenians or Armenia in general. What does he have to explain to his people? How does he explain to his people that after $250 trillion in oil wealth that's come to the country, they are now the poorest people in the Caucasus? How does he explain to them that they are the most corrupt people in the Caucasus? How does he explain to them that they have the lowest growth rate in Europe over the last 10 years? How does he explain to them that they are by far the least free people in this region? The only thing that he can do is to distract them, since he knows he cannot change any of those things. What he can do is to create a foreign enemy that he can demonize. The only thing that can change this equation so we can actually have formal peace for everyone's purposes is two things. One is for the international community to clearly outline who is the aggressor in this case and make it clear to Aliyev that his aggressions on our borders are not acceptable, which is something they have clearly not done. And the second thing, and most important thing, is for us to change that equation by building up our military, by rebuilding our defenses, and creating a situation in which any such ambitions or actions by Aliyev in our borders become very costly. At the end of the day, when you're dealing with politically gangster states like Aliyev's, that is the only incentive system that he understands. Everything else is empty talk. Thank you for joining us at this week's edition of Insights.